here's a very easy way to fix your deadlift if you have a broken deadlift. Now I can speak on this because I had that cat back rounding, the unfixable pull, the oh my god, is your back not smashed up to smithereens, to how do I ride my back just like you. Well, in this video, we're going to discuss exactly how to do that. But before we get to the video, please like the video, subscribe, comment what you'd like to see next. So when it comes to deadlift, you want to build from the ground up. You got to understand that the ankle joint, knees, and hips all have to do with the deadlift, in which if you want to stay stable, you have to respect the midfoot. Essentially the side of your foot from a side profile view, starting from the toes to the back of your heel, not the front of your shins. The midfoot is relative to your entire foot. Imagine cutting your foot in half. That's where you want to be looking down, and that's where the bar should be setting, which a lot of times people are cued to pushing the bar to their shins to make contact, or too far forward where you do not get to engage the quads. So with this midfoot, you want to align the knees and the shoulders. If the shoulders are aligning too far behind the bar, then you're probably engaging your glutes and hamstrings off the bat with some lumbar, which isn't ideal. And if you're too far over the bar, it's a good chance your legs are going to lock out very fast and it's going to be like a good morning or an RDL. And so this brings us to point number 2. The deadlift is not about pulling. It's called a pull, but you want to initiate the lift with a push from the quads by having the knees over the bar ever so slightly, and that no hip movement should be engaging unless the weights are moving off the floor, as well as your back position should not change, meaning it should not be more flexed. As the lift is progressing, it should actually be reaching a more neutral, extended state. So for hip height, we don't want too low, but we want low enough so you could bend the knees, which has to do with your dorsiflexion as well, so that we can align the barbell, the knees, and the shoulders. Moving on to tip number 3, pulling with a neutral spine should not be the primary focus of starting a pull. Now don't get me wrong, it's still important to pull with a neutral spine, specifically to have more load on the lower body, such as the quads, glutes, and hamstrings, and to lessen the stress on the lumbar. A little bit of thoracic rounding is okay, and what it offers is an eccentric loading of the spinal erectors, and it only really becomes dangerous when there's shifting in the amount of spinal flexion when initiating the pull. If you're reaching more extension as you finish the lift, that's okay, but if you engage with a certain amount of flexion and then the amount of back flexion increases as you pull, that's where you want to become more neutral with your training. As someone who trains with a thoracic round, I purposely try to keep my back down or lower intensity training with a little bit less spinal flexion so that I can increase the loading for my quads, glutes, hamstrings, and take some of that load off the spinal erectors as they tend to recover a little bit slower compared to the other lower body muscle groups. Moving on to point number 5, stop trying to mimic other people's technique unless you have similar leverages to them. If you have short femurs, not like myself, maybe thoracic rounding is not for you. Maybe sumo stance deadlift, cheater stance, just kidding, is something that fits your biomechanics better. The entire context of this video does not necessarily apply for sumo, just take that into mind. But if you're pulling conventional, always try to go for a narrow stance, about feet under your hip sockets, and have your hands right on the outside of your shins. Pulling with a narrow stance will allow you to keep a higher hip height while being able to engage the quads off the floor with pushing from pure knee extension, then hinging with a pull. Push, then pull. Now the final point of all this stuff is to be task oriented to your deficiencies with your training. You might think your deadlift is perfect. I guarantee no one's deadlift is perfect because you always work on a specific point to get stronger at that'll allow you to hit new heights, new strengths, and it's all about making your weak points stronger. So here's a couple of specific exercises you would want to address according to the quote unquote deficiencies in your form. But before assigning you what movement you should be doing for X issue, know that making long-term changes takes a lot to adapt to for your motor control patterns. Most of the changes I give to my clients are changes that cannot be applied right away because it takes weeks, even months to relearn how to move. So if you're going to relearn how to move, you have to make sure that you're using appropriate loads and that you're purposely changing the way you pull and you're not just relying on a default setting so that you do not get frustrated, then get injured. So now let's get to some prescribed accessories that can help out your deadlift technique. If you have trouble with staying neutral off the bottom or start of your pull, try going beltless with your training. Now the thinking is that by going beltless, you're going to be a little bit more neutral when pulling because you're not going to have that band-aid on, aka the belt, to aggressively brace against. And so your pulling technique might get a little bit different since you're going to feel more vulnerable. Basically, you're going to feel like your back's going to snap if you start rounding like crazy off the floor. So you have to go lighter on your beltless work, as the positioning of your initial pull is going to be the primary focus of this beltless accessory. Now, if you have difficulty engaging the quads off the floor or getting quote unquote leg drive, feeling the push then the pull, and you're feeling glutes, hamstrings, whatever, right off the floor, that means you're pulling off the floor. You don't want to pull off the floor. If you're pulling off the floor, you need to work on a long-term movement and a short-term movement to ingrain the movement pattern and to allow your body to catch up with heavier loads. The long-term investment of leg drive is going to be working on deficit deadlifts. With a deficit deadlift, you have to have the knees over the bar and preferably keep a more neutral back position. You're going to feel your quads way more. The big disadvantage about having deficit deadlifts is that you're going to lose out on carryover to actual deadlifts because you're changing the starting position so aggressively by going so low to the floor. And that's why this is more of a long-term movement, because it's going to build up your quads, and a more short-term movement that's going to develop more so the movement pattern to keep the knees over the bars as you transfer to the hinge. And so the short-term movement is to do off-floor pause deadlifting, where you're purposely keeping the knees aligned with the bar. Keep in mind, if you have poor dorsiflexion for either the long-term or short-term accessory, i.e. deficit deadlifts or off-floor pause deadlifting, you need a little bit of mobility to make sure that the quads could hang over the bar. Now, the final accessory that's going to be more difficult to fix is going to be your lockout, which is sometimes ambiguous with the lower back trying to compensate like the lumbar, and this happens from not having strong enough glutes and hamstrings. If this is you, you're going to directly benefit from doing hinge work, not only RDLs is a great carryover movement, but good mornings, and essentially any version of a hinge movement is going to benefit your lockout and your glutes. This is why low bar squatting, which has a bit of a hinge at the top, is so effective for building up your deadlift, and vice versa. If you're not doing SBD and you want a stronger hinge, try the Pete Rubish barbell hyperextensions. From a hypertrophy standpoint, they're not the greatest, but they're certainly effective for overloading and for building stronger glutes. In my opinion, it's much better than doing heavy barbell hip thrusting, because stacking like 6-7 plates on a hip thrust is definitely going to fatigue you, and it doesn't really get to incorporate the lumbar or spinal erectors such as a barbell hyperextension does. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like the video, comment what you'd want to see next. Thank you for everyone that watched the video. If you want coaching, opening more spots by the end of April. And please, if you're thinking about purchasing some Young LA gear or huge supplements, please use code JUSTLEE. It would help a lot right now. Thank you everyone for watching. Peace out.